Welcome to the EMD Campus Ministry Podcast. On this episode, we go over the first part of the Apostles' Creed, I believe in God, the Father Almighty. We discuss why we refer to God as Father, as well as what we mean when we say that God is Almighty. We hope you are enriched by our conversation. All right, so on that note, so we're going to start talking through the Apostles' Creed. I want to start with the first line, because it is broken down into 12 lines. I don't know. Do you know, was that intentional? Because the 12 apostles, I've read some sources where it was broken down into 12 as a reference to the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles, just to make another reference to it, like as a representative, like to represent that. But I don't know if that was done at the time or if that was something that was added later. But just a fun fact, the Apostles' Creed is 12 lines. So
when I was researching, I didn't see anything to come across that, but I'm not a big believer in like the numerology stuff, but it is a really fun and cool coincidence.
yeah. Now, I'm not huge into numerology either, but I mean, if I was writing something and I'd call it the Apostles' Creed, they'd be like, it's got to have 12 of something. I mean, come on, it's the 12 apostles.
12 is
That's,
important. I mean, that
yeah,
might have been intentional, just in the culture they were in. I don't know. But
true. Well, like we said, in the intro, um, these are people just like us. So I'm sure someone did think that. Just like, why don't we have 12 lines since there were 12 apostles and the 12 tribes of Israel? I mean, come on, guys. That makes a lot of sense. Like, all right, let's do it.
sounds cool.
Who knows? Yeah. But I guess I want to hit on the first half of the first line, but I guess we can do more. It's up to you. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, is sort of the half of that line. I think there's so much there already, especially just that first part, right? Like, I believe in God, because that's such a huge topic. So I was in a Sunday school class several years ago, and the question was asked, how do you envision God?
Oh man,
Like, what do you imagine him to be? Like, when you picture him, what does he look like? What does he sound like? How does he act? And I just remember everyone in the class had like totally blank faces for like a solid 5 minutes. Like, it was really awkward. But like it was weird because everyone was silent because they had no idea how to answer that question. Like, I'm not ripping on them at all. Like, I didn't really know how to answer the question either. Uh, but it's like, how often do we even think about that? Like, when we really want to imagine what God is like, do we even know how to answer that question?
it is tough
Which
to
is so
follow.
fundamental to Christianity, right? Because we all believe, oh yeah, I believe in God. Like, okay, well, what's God like? I don't know. Yeah.
No,
Sorry, I think I interrupted you. You were going to say something.
no. You were on a roll. I shouldn't have cut you off. I was just like, yeah, it's a little hard to believe and profess in somebody if you can't explain a thing about them.
Yeah. So it was actually a pretty fun exercise to just look through what some of my resources had to say about it, because a lot of it was just refreshing to be reminded of, because we don't really think about it that much. Like, we pray to God, but I don't know, do we really imagine what that's like on his end? Like, how is he responding to it? Are we just talking to an answering machine? You're like, like, I don't know. But some of the things, so I have document pulled up here. It's organized kind of weird. I know you can look at it, see if you want to change around anything, but it's up to you.
Oh, you're good. I want to keep going. I like where you're going with this first part. I got some stuff for Almighty, but if you want to dive into the first part of this, I'm happy to follow your lead here.
When we talk about God, obviously we're talking about like a very immense concept, right? Like, sort of all the things we can think about to describe him, like omnipresent, omniscient, like all knowing, all powerful. These are like all perfect. These are pretty major concepts. So it was interesting in a debate between John Lennox, who's a mathematician at Cambridge, and Richard Dawkins, who's pretty well known atheist.
It's a little.
Yeah, fairly well known. Dawkins actually made a pretty good point in this debate. I don't remember exactly when it was. They've had a few debates that are just fascinating to watch and listen to. But Dawkins made the point. He said, how is it possible that a being of such immensity can be understood by us? I mean, that's like an ant trying to understand a human. Like, how how can we believe in something that is so beyond our capacity to understand? Like, that just didn't make sense to him. Which, fair play. That's a pretty good point. I think. But then Linux came back and said, "Well, that's true, but let me, put it to you this way: if you and I went out to lunch and you just never talked to me, you never opened up to me, how could I understand who you are? Like, I could have a data sheet of like facts about you, but I wouldn't really know you unless you chose to reveal yourself to me." Right? It's sort of like so my wife and I met on an online dating site. Uh, which is fine. We're proud of it, and it's just a fun fact of how we met. But it's not like the information we had posted on the site was like all we needed to know about each other. Like, we had the date, we had the just experience life together, get to know each other, and we just sort of had to reveal parts of ourselves um, that you just can't just put down in like a fact sheet. So the point Linux was trying to make was we can know who God is because he reveals himself to us, which is a core aspect of actually what the church believes, that God is a self revealing God. He's not a God who had to be discovered by someone. He is not. Okay, an awkward gap. I'm going to have to cut this part out. But, but I thought that was a pretty important place to start, at least, because the idea of a self revealing God also communicates the idea that God is also very personal,
Mm.
that he has chosen to interact with his creation, which is, I think, a very core aspect of what we believe about the character of God and his personality and what he's like. Obviously, we can build a lot off of that, but in talking about God and what we believe about God, I felt like we had to start somewhere, so might as well start with that. That
Yeah,
the fact that we can even know about who God is the fact that He has revealed that to us.
that was powerful. Can I jump in on a couple things here? Can I riff with you?
Yes, please.
So, I was thinking about the study that we were doing, right? When we were kind of doing our homework here. And one of the notes that I had made to myself was that they had put this line in, and what you're saying is spot on with it. Like, the God that they're talking about introduces himself as God the Father, which is
Mm,
exactly what you're talking about. Now, Father has specific language and it's a specific metaphor that we'll get into in a minute. But the idea is that he's knowable in that sense, right? That he's understood in this way. And it's different because the God of the Gnostics and Marcion we're talking about were very different, right?
mm,
This God was very far away and very separate, and you couldn't know him. And he was just good, and you just had to know that he was good, and that was really all there is to know about it. And that he was powerful and separate there. But the Dawkins question really hones in on the problem with that. Like, okay, how am I supposed to believe he's good if I know nothing about this person except for except for the fact that he exists in this other plane that I can't hope to get to unless he bails me out?
yeah.
And I think that's just bad theology because Christians do this too, right?
Mm,
We think about this being in the sky that's like a big ball of light, or stop me if you've heard this one before, the guy in all white with the beard,
yeah. Yep.
or if you're a millennial, Morgan Freeman. You know, it's
Hey,
just
fair enough.
yeah, anybody who's ever watched a movie that has had God in it, Morgan Freeman has also been in. So I just, he's got a great voice. Say what you want. Sometimes it is
Yeah.
big to think about his voice as God, but maybe we could say his voice is godly if we believe in forms. I don't know, but that's not important. What is important is simply this: that this God is personable and he introduces himself to us, like you're saying, right? And he does that through a variety of different ways, but he reveals himself to us and he's active and present. And then he comes in, and he says, "Hey, here's how you talk about me. I'm the Father," right? And it's different
Mm,
than the way Marcy understood it, because God the Father really wasn't a thing. It was just God, full stop, right? He's
yeah.
not God, full stop. And I think we need to get past that, because if we don't think about God in those terms the way you just said, we'll end up in that stuck kind of wheelhouse that Dawkins is in, because Dawkins is asking a logical question: how do I
Hmm.
comprehend something that's beyond my comprehension?
Yeah.
You know, it is
Hmm.
literally like a paradox. And the idea that Linux is getting at, and what you're getting at here, is it's no, 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 because this thing is revealed to you,
Yeah.
right? It's personal, it's active, it's breathing.
Hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of those Christian movies from like the 50s and 60s. I don't know if you've seen some of those. The one that pops out of my head is I Beheld His Glory, which is I find it to be hilarious. It's super boring, but it's hilarious. But in a lot of these movies, uh, I think even the Jesus film does this, which I want to be. I don't want to poo poo on the Jesus film, but they sort of it's weird because Jesus, obviously as God, but in these movies he's depicted as like so stoic and like so cardboard. Like he doesn't laugh. Sometimes he does. He doesn't really make jokes. He rarely smiles. He doesn't get upset. Like he's very calm, and it's so bizarre
Yeah.
uh, that it just doesn't feel real. So one thing I really appreciated when Passion of the Christ came out is it actually depicted, I thought, like a human person. Like there's this scene that in the circles I don't know if this was part of a bigger conversation, but in some of the circles I was around when the movie came out, got a little upset by this scene in the Passion of the Christ, where it's a flashback of Jesus showing his mom this table that he's building, and she says, well, like this table doesn't make any sense, like it's so high up, and he's trying to explain to her, he's like, oh no, rich people like they sit on chairs, so they're like at a table like this, and she's like, hey, I don't get this. And Jesus is just kind of messing with her, or like this other scene where he like splashes water in her face and just kind of runs off like a kid. And some people were offended by that. They were like, what, like that's so weird. And I'm like, no, like that's what a person would do. Like he has a personality. Like he's not just this cardboard box, and just like has no sense of humor or anything like that. So yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of times we tend to default to this concept of God as this impersonal thing that is boring
Yeah.
and just like wants to have nothing to do with us. Who's just like upset by the fact that we exist. Like he's not interactive at all.
Yeah. And then more to the point, what you're saying is that they connect it with God the Father. And we talked about it being revealed. And it really
Mm-hmm.
kind of validates some of the critique we talked about that Marcion said when he threw out the Old Testament, because that didn't have anything to do with Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, they talk about God the Father and they use it in no uncertain terms that are really tied to the Hebrew language of God as Father, right? That metaphor and that
Yeah.
monotheistic thought. And I think it's really powerful stuff. It's a subtle little way to pull in the way we've historically talked about God, but also who God is. It's really good stuff.
Yeah. And it's not a new idea either. Like
No?
I don't know if this is an idea that's out there, but in talking about how the creeds developed as sort of responses to these perversions of the Christian faith, um, the idea of a personal God predates Jesus. Even like it's not like I don't know how we get on this idea. I think part of it is just illiteracy of Old Testament, where we, for whatever reason, think that the God of the Old Testament is so much different than Jesus. That the God of the Old Testament is like this, very authoritarian figure who is that like stoic entity. Um, but like you go right back to like the oldest part of the Hebrew Bible, and you go to like the creation narrative, and it communicates this idea of a very personal God, which even culturally at that time was really strange. It was sort of a ridiculous concept in the ancient world,
Mm-hmm.
because it that idea stood alone. Like around like Israel's neighbors, like they didn't have a concept like this. So this is a very old idea. Actually, it's not something new. The idea of a personal God, like this, is at the very core of uh, Christianity and even just the history of our theology.
Powerful. Can we hop in a little bit to the word Almighty here?
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
And I didn't know if you had anything else when we're talking about God, but when we get into it, he says that God the Father Almighty and all those ties. The idea for this word here is that this word Almighty means all ruling,
Hmm.
right? And the idea of all ruling in Greek, what it translates to in English would be something closer to the lungs of rules all places, right? So the idea
Mm-hmm.
would be that it rules not only our physical plane of existence, but the spiritual one, if we can even divide the two, right?
Mm-hmm.
So everything is under this God's jurisdiction. Whereas Marcion was teaching, now it's a spiritual thing. So when we're talking about this detached God figure, it's just even hammering that point home. Like he doesn't just rule heaven. Like this dude's like got like active power and is involved in ruling this earth, right? Like he's there in those moments of tragedy and triumph. Like that's an important critical piece. So I just wanted to make sure that like I tacked that on there before we moved on to the next line about God the Father and Almighty, because it's really powerful stuff. And this stuff is sermon stuff. This will preach.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And on that note, like, is God the Father Almighty, kind of going along the lines of, omnipotent, like all powerful. Um, so I'm gonna throw. You'll definitely appreciate this part. So in my reading, I came across some of the philosophical paradoxes of a statement like that.
Hmm.
Like, I'm sure you know the common one: Can God create a boulder that's too large for Him to lift? Is that whole paradox?
Oh, I hate these questions. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, if you study
Well,
Wittgenstein and you learn about language games, you can understand why he wrote all this stuff because you had to listen to questions like this. And someone once told me that philosophers and theologians, and this is not true, but also partially true at the same time. They are not as concerned about being smart or right as much as they're concerned about being clever. Um, and
I
sometimes
think that's a fair point.
you
I'd
wonder,
concede to that.
yeah, I made philosophy, so I need to own that, but it's a little on the nose.
Yeah, but it's fine. But I guess to sort of tie into, I guess, the practical application of that paradox is because it is sort of a paradoxical claim. It feels, well, I should say, it feels like a paradoxical claim when we say God is all powerful, but at the same time, we run into the question of, well, if God is all powerful, then why does evil exist? Which there we get into theodicy, the problem of evil,
Yeah,
um, or why doesn't he, or does he control everything? In which case, why does evil happen? Does he cause evil to happen? So that claim of all powerful just seems really strange. Actually, like it's sort of hard to teach that. Because it feels like you just run into all these obstacles that you have to sort of finagle your way around. Um, I don't know if you have a comment on that. I do have a next step I was going to take with that, but I don't know if you want to jump in at all.
The only thing I'll have to say is that I actually was going to briefly discuss this when we started talking about the person of Jesus and we started talking
Ah,
about resurrection and justice. I hinted at it
okay,
earlier, but just a little peek at what's coming, a little peek under the hood. That there's more to come here. But yeah, Ben, I want to hear what you have to say about God and as God the Father. But I was going to make my
okay.
more toward Christian theism and the way we construct justice.
No, it's all good. Um, so I thought this was pretty clever. I guess C.S. Lewis actually addressed this in his book, The Abolition of Man,
Yeah,
um, which this could become a huge rabbit hole. But I really liked how he sort of summarized addressing this issue of how do you describe God as all powerful when that seems to just not make sense. And he points out the fact that um, well, we really have to define what it means that something is all powerful and can do all things, because it's actually a logical impossibility.
yeah,
Because like you cannot be both just and unjust. You
yes,
cannot do both justice and injustice simultaneously.
yeah,
Like you can be presented with all possibilities, but once you begin to act, you actually just logically limit the things that you can do.
yeah.
So when we say that God is all powerful, we do claim that he has the ability to do everything that he, how do I want to put this? How do I phrase this? You might need to help me out here.
I
That
yeah.
all possibilities he has, he can do. But the thing is, with the creation he has created, he has imposed self limitations. Like he cannot create this creation to have both free will and to not have free will.
I think the word
And so
self.
there's consequences into that. What?
Yeah, no, you're dead on. I think, but I don't. I used to make this argument a lot. I don't like the word of self limitations because I think that
Okay.
feeds the argument. What I say is the way he chooses to interact because of where we're at naturally limits his options. So
Okay.
there's an argument for this about kind of the way we construct God and creation because I'm going to lay out a little later. I'm not going to call it an argument, but just kind of like an understanding of what we believe as Christians and how that addresses the problem of evil and how
Hmm.
God wants interact as justice in our world. And I think that satisfies, from a Christian perspective, strictly the problem of evil. But let's talk about it on a bigger scale real quick. You know,
Okay.
if I'm going to lay out some like logical statements, and hopefully they all make sense when we tie them together. I think it's fair to say that God can see all things, including past, present, and future. So if he's going to
Mhm.
create a world, he's going to see it as it is in the moment of creation, as it becomes part of space time, right? Because he exists separate, both simultaneously in and out of that space time, right? So he can see past, present, and future and experience those moments simultaneously, unlike we do. So it's a really hard thing to conceptualize. So he would know ultimately, to some extent, what choices we're going to make. Actually, he would know exactly what choices we're going to make. So then
Mhm.
this puts more umph into the argument of evil. However, if we know that God is all good because he's revealed himself to be all good,
Mhm.
right? That he wants
Yeah.
to have a relationship with us, that he genuinely cares, and his creation is an outpouring of his love, and that he made us in his image so that we can have discussions like this, so that we can reflect who he is in the world, right? We call it the imago Dei, right? The image of God. That's what Adam is, right? If he created us in that way, do you not think that the freedom that we experience and being able to choose what is right and wrong is a required portion of that exact existence?
Mhm.
So would it be unfair to say that God has maybe made the ultimate choice, right? We call in modal logic, they call this the best possible world, right?
Mhm.
That he's looked at all the possibilities, these other options of possible worlds, worlds of infinite freedom, of infinite no freedom, and he says this is the one where I've chosen to interact the way I've chosen to interact that can have the greatest good, but can allow that great bit of freedom. Because
Mhm.
ultimately, though, when we start putting it one way or the other, and we think of it in binary terms of either God is all powerful, or I have total human freedom, there's a place where those two collide and intersect.
Yeah.
And so when
Well,
we
it's kind of like the. Are
uh,
you getting to? Sorry to interrupt, but kind of the statement people made where God cannot be both all powerful and all good, because if
exactly,
God is all powerful, then he is not all good because he allows evil to exist, and if he is all good, then he cannot be all powerful. Otherwise, he would choose to eliminate evil.
exactly, and that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that's a language game.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that's a binary way of understanding this, because ultimately, though, we have to kind of understand it in the context with which it's happening, right? So if we have this God that we know has revealed Himself to the world, or that we can say, not only based on our faith but our experience, which I think is a valid thing to bring up. We try to.
Mhm.
I think a lot of times we're shy of saying our experience, or we're like way too gung ho about it. There's some middle wisdom there. But truthfully, like our experience of who this revealed God is, right? We've all had a moment, or at least I hope we've all had a moment in service where we felt his presence, right? That
Mhm.
idea is what I'm driving at. We know that he exists and he's revealed himself to us, and that ultimately we know he's chosen this world to be the best possible version of all worlds that could create, that this is the most good that can happen. But you can't have good without having evil, or at least we can't conceive of a world as humans where you can't have good without having evil, right?
Yeah.
Because if everything was all good all the time, we wouldn't have the concept of injustice, right? If it was perfect. But neither would we have freedom, because I can't choose to do the wrong thing in that world, right?
Yeah.
And so if humans don't have some kind of level of autonomy and separateness to where we can interact, where God comes in and breaks in the world, we can't do that. So my whole crux of my argument really kind of gets past those terms. So let's not appeal to like the structure of God or his nature. Let's not appeal to human freedom. Let's just ask what we know. Let's start with the most important thing. I think as Christians we really should focus on this. And I think
Mhm.
philosophically there's a strong argument to be made here, but I don't really want to lay it out because I don't think going into modal logic is probably a good use of our time. But I mean, let's appeal to what we know, and we know his character,
Yeah.
right? We know God's character, and
Mhm.
we know that He is good. And if He is good, I can trust, and I can reasonably trust, not just blind faith. I can reasonably trust based on my experience with this person and what's gone on in my life, that he is good and that he ultimately has things working together for the greater good. And again, I want to lay out a more sophisticated argument for that when we get down to when we talk about Jesus, specifically a spot in the line that I'm going to lay out some, I think, really powerful theology about justice, and that really kind of hammers home this point. But I want this to be my starting point for how we think about, or at least I think it's an important place to start, how we think about God. that
Hmm.
we're talking about God, we can talk about the facts of God's nature, and that's okay. That's important. We need to understand those to some extent, or have awareness of them. But the
Hmm.
most important thing is God's character,
Yeah.
because that's the fundamental starting point of the way we want to interpret the rest of, I think, the creed and the rest of how we interact with this person. Does that make sense? So your analogy with Linux, right? That's what he was talking about, is revelation, right?
Yeah.
Feeling your character by sitting across the table and talking. In God's case, you know, coming down to meet Adam and Eve, coming out as a burning bush, right? For Moses, the
Yeah.
miracles, signs, and then ultimately revealed in the person of Jesus. Sorry.
Yeah. No, no, you're good.
I hope I didn't.
Really
I
good
really
points.
messed up our outline. I know. I'm just.
No, it's fine. I mean, it was something that came up. It's good that it was addressed. So I'm like, I'm fine with it. I think that was a good explanation. Yeah, that was good.
And if you really want to read into that stuff heavily, like William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland, there are these two apologists that work out of um, Talbot School of Theology in California. Those are the people that I would go to. Reasonablefaith.org. It's called Molinism,
Hmm.
right? And they lay out much more sophisticated, like logical versions of that argument. But ultimately, the crux is the way in which we change the appeal, right?
Yeah,
And I think that's the most important thing for us to take away.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's fine. As a side note, you kind of touched on this, and this is a tangent. I always get frustrated with the claim that if God can see, I know we're sort of getting into the whole. You're like, no, let's stick with this character,
No,
and I'm just sort of like, yeah, no.
it's all good. It's important to understand. Like I don't think that's not important, but I want to hammer home. If you don't remember anything from this podcast, I don't know. I'll hijack it and say, remember that.
Yeah,
I'm,
well, that's that. Yeah, that is the core of it. That's true. You can get stuck just talking circles, and it becomes very mechanical, and you kind of lose sight. Um, but sometimes I hear this argument that free will is kind of an illusion because if God really knows everything that's going to happen, then everything's already like determined. That just does not make sense to me.
it doesn't.
Like, because it's sort of like sometimes I don't know. Like if I'm watching like rain go like falling onto my roof and I'm seeing that my gutters are clogged and like I can tell that a part of the gutter is going to burst and I know that's going to happen. Does that have any effect on the fact that that's going to happen or not? Like no, like just because I have an awareness of something doesn't change. So just because like God might be aware of the choices we make, that doesn't have any impact on the fact of how we make that choice.
Yeah, it's just the nature of autonomy. It's exactly right. If you're an autonomous and separate than God, right? And we are separate than God, right? We're not just zombies to do his will. That's not how that works, right? So people
Yeah, I mean
actively.
that's a pretty bad analogy I had. I guess a better one would be, if
No,
I
no,
see a child running and there's a pole like in the sidewalk and they're gonna run into that pole and I see them run in and they're gonna hit it. Like they're just gonna just bash their face against this thing. Like that has absolutely no effect on the fact that they're choosing to run and they're gonna hit it. Maybe that's a better analogy than watching rain. I don't know
yeah,
why I
no,
came up with that one.
no, both are good though. Like the idea is the same though. Like it's something outside of yourself that I mean, like you could. And the thing with God, the question of the problem of evil is really about responsibility.
Yeah.
And to some extent, we throw the idea of like human morality onto that, right? Like what we think justice is. But here's a funny and I think humorous counter argument to all this. If God has predestined the world to be the way it is, and it's not, there's no human autonomy, he's not very good at his job because a lot of people don't believe him or follow him or have any interest in doing it. And that sounds so playful, but I think it's true. Like I think it's really true. Um,
Yeah.
you know, wouldn't it be better to choose to abide and to be in a relationship with something and genuinely mean it than be forced, right? Like, I'm married. I like
Mhm.
my marriage, I like my wife a lot. She just texted me. Um, if she was forced to be with me, the dynamics of our relationship fundamentally change.
Yeah.
You know, and the idea of two becoming one is a way different interpretation than what it is when we make that choice together to get married
Mhm.
and to build a life together. And I think there's a reason that the New Testament uses those metaphors. Um, I think I'm just going to go down a rabbit hole, but I'm just going to leave it at that, right?
Mhm.
Like when you have a level of autonomy and freedom, you have to have room for the fudge factor, because if there's not room for the fudge factor, then we're talking about something that doesn't make sense. And then
The
we're
fudge factor?
sorry, by fudge factor I mean like the ability to choose for different things, right? That's a really bad word, like it's a really bad language to use. But like the ability to make mistakes, the ability to be
Oh,
flawed,
okay.
the ability
Yeah.
to do different things, right? Um, and if we're not free to do any of these, then we either have a God that's not good or a God that's really hard to believe in and trust, you know.
Mhm.
But also, if this God is predestined the world and only picked to save us all, but creates us all because He loves us, I think we get into this weird, really strange discussion of confusion that just, that doesn't logically follow. You know what I mean? And it just becomes this kind of like tit for tat language game, and that's why I
Mhm.
always tend to avoid that discussion. Like, well, that's why I'll appeal to his character, because that has been revealed. And I'd say it can be revealed in multiple places, and here's where I'll say it was revealed. And
Yeah.
and that's why I hammer that point home, Ben. Not because I'm trying to invalidate what others are saying, but because
Mhm.
I think that the more we get into the argument and the more we get into the nitty gritty, the more you realize that some of that nitty gritty isn't as valuable as, or can sometimes be a trap. Is really what I'm trying.
Yeah. Oh no, that's totally true. Um, yeah, it can definitely overthinking theology can can become a trap and sort of just an exercise in futility. Um, like it, like I know you would agree, theology is definitely a good thing to practice, and it is good to go through details.
Well, we've
But when you get down to it, when you actually have to live it out, the only thing that really matters is the character.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, and that's what we talked about. Like, right, our beliefs inform our character. So, believing good and right and healthy things and having good grip on the world. There's a writer I listened to that once called people well adjusted, and he said that is not an accidental term.
Hmm.
Like you've been well adjusted, you have a good perspective on the world, and you're not this kind of default person, right? Um,
Yeah.
there's a reason that language is there, and I think that applies here, right? Like you don't just fly blindly, like either with total faith or like this total theological robot. Like there's the
Hmm.
balance of give and take. But it is important to believe those right things. And everything you just said is true. We've spent this entire podcast laying out why the creeds are important,
Hmm.
what's important about them, because they inform what we do.
Yeah.
And
And
so,
it's also good that the creeds actually don't go into much detail. I think probably because the people who actually penned the creeds probably realized, you know what, we don't need to go down all these trails. Like, let's just keep it like this is substantial enough.
yeah,
Like God the Father Almighty.
yeah, yeah.
That's good.
But I mean, the
Yeah.
metaphor of Father is revealing, and we could spend time on that if you wanted to. Almighty is revealing. Remember, we talked about it. Like we're
Mhm.
not separating flesh and spirit in this analogy. We're not talking about physical world versus spiritual world. Like He's the King of all, and He's active in all. And everything we've
Mhm.
just talked about in terms of the nitty gritty of the debate, you know, is really related to that point. It's really about that we believe that He's active in that place. And we'll talk about justice a little more. I want to get into that a little later.
Yeah.
I have an argument that I want to lay out that I hope you'll appreciate now. I'm not trying to be difficult, but I hope you'll appreciate later.
Oh no, I appreciate the tease. It's all good. Something to look forward to. Thank you for joining us today. If you would like to know more about our ministry, you can visit us online at emdcampusministry.org or follow us on Facebook at EMD Campus Ministry. If you would like to be a part of our show, you can send questions, comments, or content requests through our Facebook page or email at emdcampusministry@gmail.com. Grace and peace, friends.